pleasure to be a part of this event, and I'm particularly glad that your new students are part of this particular seminar. And once you told me that it's new students have joined in new, I thought that this would be a good topic to talk to them about, rather than something which some of us may be doing as part of our own research work. And that's also very important. But I realized that, especially for the new cadre of students coming in, I want to share with them some stories and my experiences of what it has been to do philosophy in India. And I think these are the people who will really have to carry this forward. These are the people who are confronting these questions. So I thought this would be a good way to, present some of these very complex scenario, in my view, of what is happening to philosophy in India. I'm really grateful for this invitation, and as I said, it's always an honor to talk to your department. I think this is the first time I'm visiting your department, although virtually, by the way. I have, of course, been meeting many of your colleagues like Professor Anuradha, Professor Shashi, Professor Ravi, and so on in various forums, and I'm very glad that I have this chance to meet up with them in this virtual sense today. So thank you so much again. And as I said, the topic is very general, and I don't have anything deep and profound or philosophical to say about it. So I'm going to do something which is to ask a series of questions about these kinds of experiences which have underlined the idea of philosophy in India today. And there may be many points which you may have disagreements with, and maybe some parts you would have had experience yourself. So I would very much, welcome a debate or, kind of building up this, because it's not a question which I'm posing as if it is something very significant, as if I have any great answers to give. It is a question which I think all of us have to ask whenever we are working within the context of philosophy in India today. So it's a collective questioning at this stage, and I hope to sufficiently catalyze this thought in you, particularly for all the many new students, because you are in a very important premier department, and some department which has a long history and a great prestige. So I'm taking this liberty. So many of you will come out and teach elsewhere. You will do other things in the profession. So I think it's important for us, perhaps, particularly for the students, to reflect with you on this particular topic. So I'll just begin with this simple point that a lot of strange events are happening around us, including this particular phenomena, what we are doing right now here. There are a lot of strange events. And in the midst of all the strange events, socially, politically, economically, and so on, there is also the national education policy. It's a very interesting document, and I'm sure many of you have seen that document. There's a lot of, I think the document has an enormous impact on philosophy teaching in the country. And that can be a point of discussion separately. But I think there is something which we need to engage with in the document. And there are many points which we may agree, some points which we may not agree. But I think there are some important issues in that. And within the document, there are also certain underlying idea about disciplines. And I want to look at that question of a discipline first, and try and situate our understanding of philosophy within this larger point of a discipline. Now, the question I have posed for today's talk, what is it to do philosophy in India, can be posed for most other disciplines in India. You could ask, what is it to do sociology in India today? What is it to do literature in India today? I mean, these are, for people who are teaching them in all our departments, we know that these are very urgent questions, especially in a world which is filled with a surplus of information, of production of texts, which have gone way beyond our own capacity to understand them or to access them. And so this is a question which we have to ask about almost all disciplines. And when asking it in the context of India becomes extremely important, because in all these disciplines, when we are asking this question, we are asking how much autonomy do we have based on the kinds of students we get, based on the kind of society we live. How much autonomy do we have to shape a particular discipline? what constitutes, what enters into a particular discipline, what gets taught around the world as something within the discipline, how much say do all of us have in this particular larger factory of academic work around the world. So that's, as I said, these are all important questions for other disciplines, but I think for philosophy it is most important. And the reason is, of course, very clear. It's not because we come from philosophy, but because in most of these disciplines, philosophy functions subterraneously at so many ways. It is present, whether you take a discipline like literature, sociology, political science, and so on, it is present so deeply into the act of philosophy, into the act of the disciplines, that one has to really make sense of what we even define by the idea of philosophy. And one way to start this, and I know that it is not necessarily the best way to start off talking about crisis, but I think it's a good entry point. So as to place it as a form of a crisis, and you might say that perhaps I'm exaggerating when I want to present philosophy as a mode of crisis, but let me begin with that in order to try and use that, rhetorically, if you feel it's not real, at least rhetorically to use it to say something about the task of philosophy. So one, I would say that there are a lot of crises, different sorts of crises facing philosophy today. One you could call, just to use a very anthropocentric images, one you could call as an identity crisis. And I think there is definitely a deep identity crisis within philosophy. And the way you can formulate it is a question, what is philosophy? And what is it to do philosophy? And I'm sure all of you, since you're all professionals in this discipline, you know that. And I'm not suggesting that you don't. I'm saying I don't. I often know what it is. How do I define philosophy? What is it to do philosophy? And when I deal with so many students and other professionals around the country, this question comes back in so many different ways. And I'll give you reasons why I say this. And that's an identity crisis, which is much less than any other disciplines. It's very rare that somebody from a physics department will go to another physics department and people will say, no, are you doing physics? What you're doing is not really physics. That's not what we call as physics. And those kinds of questions rarely, it almost doesn't come unless people are really, pushing the boundary in some sense. But in philosophy, it's common. And I'll give you examples for that, on why this becomes a central question for philosophy. There is also an existential crisis, in a sense, linked to this. An existential crisis of, the way I would phrase it is, am I really doing philosophy? I don't know what philosophy is. I do not know what it is to do. But when I'm doing it, when I'm writing something, when I'm talking about something, maybe about ethics, or I'm talking about, knowledge and stuff, there's a deep and troubling question. Am I doing philosophy? And if so, how do I know that I'm actually, what is the pointer which says, yes, I am doing something called philosophy? And of course, related questions are others doing it better than I am. These are larger disciplinary questions, not specific to philosophy, but this becomes part of the existential crisis. And then I think there's also a crisis of confidence. And I think the crisis of confidence really affects students and philosophy writing in India. If you look at the number of original work which should be coming out from such bright minds like all the students who are all going to enter into the field, or the hundreds of others who have come out of systems like these who are doing philosophy in India, very bright young minds. And then you ask the question, compare it to the global production of philosophy, for example, or about the circulation of global ideas in philosophy. Is it that we are not doing enough? I'm not even going to take a position on this. I'm just asking a larger question. Could it be that we could be doing something differently, more innovative, more original? Is it possible for the kind of a philosophical richness to arise from our daily practices of philosophy in India? And I think that is very much related to what I see as a crisis of confidence, is something which I might explain later down. So let me address this question by starting with something very different, something to take you away from this wonderful position you are in as students of a well-known department and so on, and look at people who are doing philosophy in a completely different manner. So I want to start with the question, who is actually doing philosophy today? Okay, and when I'm saying who is doing philosophy, it has many implications in it, but I'll just, as of now, let's assume I understand the question, and so who is doing philosophy today? When one, of course, the very few philosophy departments around the country, and there are not many. And now, very interestingly, there are more private universities which are starting it. Just if I could, just make a small correction to what Professor Balaganapati was saying about our Manipal program. It was the cheapest course in, not just in Manipal University, which was my demand when I went there, but it had this, what we aimed to do was to offer, a really, what we felt was a very good quality interdisciplinary philosophy program with all access to everything the student wants, with 30,000 rupees as a yearly fees. That's what we began with. And that was my negotiation with the university to say that's the only way in which we will come, because we want to make sure that this is not immediately seen as a place where you're going to make money from this. But what you say is very true. Today, the greatest support to philosophy in the education sector is coming from private universities. And we know places like Ashoka, Kriya, Flame, and many other universities do have philosophy programs, independent philosophy programs, and where students do pay a few lakhs to join this particular these courses. So who are the ones who are doing this? So one is, of course, a few philosophy departments. But two, what is more interesting to me is there are many in the formal and the informal sectors who are doing philosophy, who are not in the philosophy department. So I want to begin with all those people who are not present within our formal structures of a philosophy department, who think they are doing philosophy, who are doing philosophy, and who I think are also doing philosophy. And this leads to a particular kind of a conflict. I want to make sense of this question. So who are these people who do it? In every department around us, people are doing philosophy. In fact, very ironically, in my many visits to DU or to JNU, particularly to JNU because I was working with Gopal Guru extensively, I have spoken in almost every department at JNU, many times at political science, sociology, arts and aesthetics, language, German studies, but never in philosophy department. I don't know where the philosophy department is. Of course, in DU, I have come to linguistics and other departments. But the point I'm trying to say is not because I didn't speak. That's the most irrelevant part of this whole thing. And what I'm trying to say is the people who are engaging with the idea of philosophy seem to be distributed across disciplines, but yet they do not seem to be doing the kind of classes and training which you do for your students. So which our students in the philosophy departments do. So what does that mean? So let me give you an example. English literature has, I think, draws a lot on philosophy. I think rather than saying literature does a lot of philosophy, I would say they draw a lot on philosophers. And I have this running battle with them on what is it that they mean when they draw on philosophers. And of course, much of it was driven by the French continental tradition, with Gayatri Spivak and Derrida and the whole Paul de Man and others who really brought the question of philosophy into literary studies in a very deep sense. But there is the way they do philosophy, the trajectory of how they do philosophy might differ. And I think I often pay attention to that rather than thinking they're doing English or literature. I want to understand what is it that they do with these things which we call philosophy in a way which is very different than what I would want my students to do or what I think I should be doing. Is there a distinction we can make like that? It's not just the French tradition. I know a very interesting professor of English in Karnataka, Professor Gundur, who thinks that philosophy and philosophy of science, not who thinks, that who teaches philosophy and philosophy of science for his literature students, because he thinks that's an extremely important training for literature. And what he means by teaching philosophy and philosophy of science is what we would call as teaching formal philosophy and philosophy of science, in the sense what we would teach for our students of philosophy, not some, so this engagement is very important because they think that it is speaking something to the question of literature. It's rethinking literature at the same time of saying, how does philosophy play a part in my teaching literature? It happened in sociology enormously today. There's a lot more. I mean, social ontology, of course, is a very philosophical subdomain of philosophy, but even across the domain, people who talk about religion, caste, draw upon philosophy in very many interesting ways. In political science, is far more closer to philosophy because of the very fact of many of the kinds of themes it engages with, including questions of concepts of justice, equality, secularism, and so on. So the vocabulary needed for doing that are often drawn from philosophy and philosophers. So they're all doing philosophy. So the philosophy department is in a big, it's in a big ecosystem in which many people feel that they're doing philosophy, think that they're doing philosophy, and are doing philosophy, but yet there is a massive gap between the philosophy department as a department or philosophy community as a community and all these other communities. And I want to address that point again very closely. If this is in the formal education sectors like universities, it is bigger in the non-formal sector. And I'm sure some of you know this, but definitely all of you are entering into philosophy. I hope you pay consideration to this, and unlike earlier times, not dismiss them as saying these are not philosophy, etc. I'll give you an example. I'll start with two very quick examples. Dalai Lama does many of these Buddhism science meetings, and I've been part of some of them, and many of them are interesting in their own ways, and I think there's a lot of discussion about interesting points. And I remember a few years back there was a meeting in Gangtok, and it was at the end of December. If I remember right, it's almost at the last few days of December. So it was extremely cold, and they were having it in a monastery. And when we went to the conference, it's kind of a meeting for 4 days. Then they announced that the Dalai Lama was coming to that conference. And because he was visiting Sikkim, he had decided to give his public teaching on the first 4 days in the morning. So all the conference things were postponed to the afternoon. And they said, if those of you who want to go see the Dalai Lama teaching could go. So obviously I was very interested. So I went on the first day when it started. I still remember it was at 7:30 or so in the morning on a very cold, wintry December day in Gangtok. And the meeting was held in the football stadium of Gangtok. So when I went there, I found a large number of people walking to it. It's like you're going to a football match, except that it is supposed to be a talk. And I go to the football stadium. There are people in their thousands sitting all over, families, children running, many people sitting around there. And then there were volunteers giving people buns and tea and stuff like that. And the Dalai Lama was speaking there. And they gave us small booklets to follow what he's saying, because although it was translated in Nepali, he was speaking in Tibetan. And so I was opening that book to see what is it he's talking about and what is it that 30,000 people are listening to. He is actually giving a philosophical lesson, a lesson which I would have liked to have given to my students in class. He was talking in that section which I sat in. It was about the existence of the self and the non-self. And it was actually about Nagarjuna's text. And anybody who has done Nagarjuna's text, which I think must be, Mula Madhyamika Karika, and the text as well as its translations, which I think should be a must read for every philosophy student who comes through your program. It is not an easy text. It is a text with so much of complexity and so much of rigor. What does it mean for somebody like him to sit there and do for 4 days, telling people how to think about this question in a way which I think is actually quite rigorous? This is not just one-off incident. It's not about are all those 30,000 people philosophy students, or what are they? I'll give you another instance exactly on the southern part of India, a complete diametrically opposite to Sikkim. It's in a small temple town in Tamil Nadu. And there are a large number of traditional scholars in these places. And I wanted to go listen to when I was visiting that area, somebody said there is a well-known traditional scholar who is speaking on something. So I thought I should go listen to him to see what kind of thing it is. So this is actually held in a courtyard of a temple. And when I went in, it's like let's say a talk at 3:30 or so. There are about 20-30 people sitting there. And most of them are middle-aged women and men and women. Okay, many of them retired, middle-aged, men and women, sitting in traditional attire, but all of them carrying books and pen. And they are sitting there listening to this person. And what did this person talk about? He was giving one elaborate discussion on the nature of reality, how the question of reality addresses itself. There was some overlap with the question of our self and so on. And there was nothing in it which either had to do with the temple or what we see as notions of religion. It was just a pure, again, as I said, a class which many of you would have been teaching your students. And these are all the students, and you know, these classes are far more rigorous and far more intense than many of my own classes or our classes in our universities. When I was talking to some of these people, they said some of these classes have been going on for 3 to 5 years. They meet every week, 3-4 times. They read texts. And when they read text like what you would teach your students to read text. Read them, break the words, look at meanings, look at all kinds of stuff, how texts are constructed and so on. So where is this? Who are all these people? Are they doing philosophy? Should we even consider them that they are doing philosophy? You see this all the time in Buddhist monasteries. You go to Bailakuppe, you will see it in every monastery there. You are seeing it in so many mattas, the Hindu mattas, which you will see. You see it in so many seminaries. The amount of philosophy which is done in Christian seminaries is much more than what we can imagine within the university systems. And when I was in Kerala, in one of these workshops I was doing, I met students who came from Islamic universities in Kerala, where they say they do philosophy in the way we think of philosophy. That one of the students I met for 15 years, they've been doing philosophy, and he was telling me, among other things that he does, are all that what you would teach within with philosophers like Descartes and Kant. And of course, the great thing for him, for these students, was that they also did the Arabic philosophers, which we don't normally teach in our programs, as part of a kind of a learning of philosophical traditions. So what is this? Are they doing philosophy? Should they be part of our philosophy community? And what kind of philosophy are they doing? And then, of course, the enormous growth of popular philosophizing, ranging from people like Sri Sri to Sadhguru and 100 others. And if you talk to them, all of them would invoke the word philosophy much more than any of us do. In other words, what I'm saying is, philosophy in the public consciousness is filtered through the articulations of these people. And so tomorrow when people think of what philosophy is, they are trying to tell you what Sadhguru said in one of his talks. And this is something which I have seen across, and I'm sure many of you would have also had this experience. Many people, when they first know, if they ask, what are you working on, which department, which discipline you work on, if you say philosophy, they think that it is religion. Or they think it's something to do with spirituality or something like that. And that's because in the public consciousness, a particular notions of philosophy is often propagated. There's another huge non-formal sector, and that's in rural India, which again does not come into our major university systems in places like Delhi, Bombay, Hyderabad, Calcutta, etc. And among the many of the rural places, there are many of them, it's happening. As far as I know, it's happening very vibrantly in the south. I don't know enough about the north. I can give you an example in Karnataka of a place called Neenasam, which is a very important theatre institute and a cultural center. There are many theatre and art groups with whom I work with. All of them are so deeply engaged with the question of philosophy. Many of them with whom you can have discussions on philosophical texts, but none of them are going to be in part of this particular kinds, and none of them are going to write the UGC, that all this set exam and net exams and so on. You see philosophy's flourishing, philosophy's engagement, a discourse of philosophy between activists and designers. And who are the people who are listening to this? I'll give you one example of what I did with Neenasam once. For a couple of years back, or 1.5 years back, a couple of years back, I did a 1-week workshop called Alochane, which is a 1-week, it traveled from each town, many of them very small villages and towns, where we did a 1-day workshop. It was called Thinking Workshop, but basically it was an introduction to philosophy with different dimensions to it. And we had so many people attend each one of them, ranging from farmers to students to teachers. And that was a particularly important constituent to us. And it's quite amazing. It's not just about the question, again, which what Professor Balaganathi was saying about the interest in philosophy. It is also the kind of engagement with philosophy and the ways in which they understand philosophy, in which they look to us to see what does philosophy contribute to, to the kinds of questions they ask and try and understand. And then I discovered another extremely interesting philosophical practice. And I'm sure some of you may have heard of it, but it's a philosophical tradition, again in Karnataka, called Tattva Padas. I first heard of it a few years back by Professor Rahmat Tarikere, who did a very interesting talk on it. And then last year or 2 years, or last year, I think in Neenasam, we did a performance of Tattva Padas, and Tattva Padas are very interesting. Actually, that is the closest to philosophy in practice. It is about people sitting and talking about philosophy overnight. People just sit, people come and gather, and there is a discussion, there is a singing. So when I asked one of them, I think it was Professor Rahmat, when I asked him, what does the word tattva actually mean for these people in the way in which you use it? He said, tattva is what we mean, is the word for philosophy that they use, but tattva also means song. And to me, when I heard the Tattva Padas in Neenasam last year, I was moved. It was such a moving experience after so many years of doing this philosophy to really see a completely different articulation of philosophy. Many of whom you might think, when we come from our degrees and our universities and so on, we might say they are illiterate or uneducated. They are performers who bring a kind of gravitas of thinking so deeply into this practice, in which becomes part of everyday philosophy. And this is happening all around us. So when people say philosophy is very less, which is happening around, or people are not coming, obviously the educationists and the government I don't know why they would say it. Are they scared of philosophers? I haven't seen anything which any of us have done as a community for the government to be scared of us. And then to add to this, there are an enormous number of publications in philosophy in many vernacular languages. And none of them enter into our stream of our teaching within the postgraduate or even the undergraduate programs in many of these universities, because we, of course, depend on English text and we miss out a very large number. I can tell you again from the South, and I know it's also true in Hindi and Bengal, of course, but definitely the kind of deep philosophical text and the kinds of people who are writing it. So there's a recent book by this well-known playwright and theater director, K.V. Akshara, who wrote a book on, a travelogue with Shankara in Kannada. And it was a phenomenally interesting attempt to understand Advaita. It's actually a philosophical text, but done in a completely different manner. There is another person who is a Tamil scholar, Srinivas Ramanujam. He wrote a book which won some awards in non-fiction Tamil, and then he rewrote it in English, and it is published by Routledge as a book, Renunciation and Untouchability. And it's a very deeply philosophical book on looking at this question of renunciation and untouchability. And he's not a philosopher in the context of these philosophy departments or degrees in philosophy. I mean, these are just two examples with people whom I've engaged with deeply, but you can see this across in all languages very deeply. And where are they present in our imagination, in our classrooms, in our practices of philosophy within the Indian context? And there are many such examples. There are examples which come from, work in Kannada, Tamil, Malayalam. Some of the most interesting works on literary theories, again with philosophical basis, have all been produced. Many students in this, again, have no access to the kind of the philosophical world that we produce. Because this is the non-formal production of philosophy. And then we have the philosophy departments, which are very few, as I said. And in places where we have tried to start them, like for example, in Bangalore Central University started a philosophy program, and I helped them set it up 2 years back. And in 2 years, it's already closed because they are just not able to deal with students. People don't want to have these questions of, people often ask, people who are educators, people who are in important levels will often say, why do you need philosophy? We don't need them. So now after the first batch, it's already closed. And then you have the case of Madras University, where they had the two of their most flourishing programs within the philosophy department is the Vaishnava program and this Jain program. So when I had a chance once to visit there and I was talking to the people there, and they said most of the people who joined these programs, and this is, there are a large number of students who joined them. He said the people who are running it said most of them are housewives. So they set the class timings based on that particular question of housewives. And these are people who are learning Vaishnavism and Jainism as cultural practices, not as philosophical practices alone. And this is part of the philosophy department in Madras University of Madras. But the most funniest example of why people do philosophy I heard it was true because it was somebody from Delhi who said it, and I think it's one of the Delhi colleges, but I may be wrong, but I've quoted this in some place. But this was told to me by a person who said, in one of the years in the Buddhist philosophy program, they suddenly found a large number of well-built guys in the class, and everybody was very puzzled. And then they realized, it seems, that these were bodybuilders who joined the philosophy class for bus passes. So that is, I think philosophy does a kind of a service across from, whether it's a Vaishnava Jainism course to the bodybuilders. So who are interested in philosophy then? Is this the large number of, people we are talking about? Should they be called as philosophers? Or should they not be called as philosophers? Are people really interested in philosophy? I'll just share very quickly with you that, when I was earlier at NIAS, I used to do a summer school every summer. And the summer school was called Philosophy for Social Science and Humanities Students. And for years, I've had some of the best students I've dealt with in these summer schools, many of whom I'm still in touch with. And all of them came to learn philosophy, but continued in their own profession. They did not shift to philosophy. They used philosophy learning in a very deep context, and there are a large number of them who do this. And then when I started the children's camp, children's philosophy workshop, there are so many people who said, what age children? I said, it's from 5th grade to 7th grade. So 10 years to 12 years was the first philosophy workshops I started doing. And they said, who will come for this? The first time we called out in Bangalore, 140 people applied, parents and children, and we couldn't do it in that big scale. So I've done many in different cities, small villages to cities, in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka, where you get children who are very interested to come and learn. And I think children are a great example of teaching and learning philosophy. But one common complaint I've heard, which I can share with you in all honesty, because this is what I've heard from people, many of them from different departments who do philosophy, etc. Then I often ask them, like I asked them in JNU or maybe at DU, why don't you go take courses in these departments, in philosophy department? You're so interested in philosophy, you're willing to come various places, do workshops and stuff. What is your engagement with the philosophy? Why don't you go and take courses in philosophy departments? There is a great wall which philosophy departments have built around themselves. And again, I'm not saying this because I have some reason to say. I'm just sharing with you an outsider's view of how students from institutions like all of these who are part of it often felt that they could not approach the philosophy department or be a part of their own coursework, teaching, etc. There are very many reasons, of course, in the size of institutions like ours, but they were also saying something very important about the nature of philosophy practice, which I will end with when I come to it. Okay. Now, one way to answer this is to say, what all these people are doing is not really philosophy. It's just some people are doing some religion, spirituality, reading some text. That's not really philosophy. And that's why I said this exists in, the identity question of what is it to really do philosophy? What is philosophy? And this, we should remember, particularly from the Indian context, is a historical question which is at the origin of the practice of modern philosophy in India, which is the question which haunts us in various ways of defining what philosophy is. Because it begins from It begins from various people, from particularly the colonial literature. It begins from some of the most post-Kantian to Hegelians and the German tradition, with claims that Asian and African traditions do not possess philosophy. And what they do is cannot be called as philosophy. It begins with that kind of a conflict. And therefore, Indian philosophy, a term which many people feel very uncomfortable with, was often put in religious departments or in Sanskrit departments or some Pali and Prakrit departments, never in the philosophy department as such. Of course, now there is a greater integration, for the last many years. So the point is, this tension still remains so deeply. I'll give you just two examples. Again, please don't misunderstand me when I give these examples. I'm giving it because these are the challenges which confront us, and I want to understand how to make sense of the challenges. I said about misunderstanding because both these examples come from people located, I think, who are deeply connected with your department, or not your department, maybe DU for sure, maybe your department. When I started the Manipal program, and my aim there was to try, it was an interdisciplinary program where we did MA in philosophy, literature, and sociology. And my aim was that people who study sociology and literature should be exposed to philosophy. And I also said that people who study philosophy should be exposed to literature and sociology. I don't think it's possible to have, at least that was my view then, and I do hold on to it to some extent, that, we do all these philosophical concepts and read all these texts and thinkers without understanding the context in which we live, the society in which we live, etc. So I felt that this was probably a useful experiment to do, and I think we had great fun doing it. But I remember after 1 or 2 years, I got a long email from somebody who is a philosopher, who is in the philosophy department, who was, some connection, who wrote to me saying, I'm very upset at what you have done, that I hear, because I had a colleague who was working on Deleuze and so on. That was his PhD work. He had done some really good work on, continental philosophy. So this person writes to me a long email saying, you are destroying philosophy by doing all this stuff. In my view, only Plato and Aristotle should be called philosophers, and any philosophy program should only teach Plato and Aristotle. I felt really, I didn't know, I knew him in a sense, and I know that something important he was saying, but, this kind of a question of, what we should be doing as philosophy and what is not philosophy is really impacting on a very free engagement with the idea of philosophy. I remember another case, again, something related, I think, to DU, where one of my friends was very upset when he saw a mail from somebody who sent a long email about how nobody is doing philosophy in India. Of course, he said, I think that person said, except for 3 people, there are nobody else who is called a philosopher in India. Nobody is doing philosophy in India. And this person has actually done what we all respected him as a philosopher. He said, what is this point? And I was telling this person, look, this is part of the problem of philosophy in India. As I said, you may have different physics people with different competences. Some people may be very good or some people may be very bad. Let's say in physics, chemistry, maths, etc. You would rarely find somebody sending a national email on context of a national committee saying that nobody is doing it except 3 of us, and none of you know what philosophy is doing. I hear this so much. It's not an exaggeration. It's so often a difficulty for our students, for myself and various other people I know, who often have to confront this question of whether what they are doing is philosophical or not philosophical. Okay, and I think we take it to an extra level when we have these public debates on questions of analytical philosophy, continental philosophy. People, these are worse than Indo-Pakistan or Russian-American wars. Somebody will say, I will never read analytical philosophy. It's all about logic and it's very dry. Then somebody will say, continental philosophy is not philosophy. And they are just parroting much of the debate which is happening outside, Chomsky is fighting with Zizek or something. So it becomes an important framework for them to understand, analytical content. Indian philosophy, for a very long time, I realized that the moment you invoke the word Indian philosophy, you are immediately labeled right-wing and this and that. I mean, what is it that we are trying to do when we are engaging in this question of philosophy? What is this kind of a tension which manifests itself in the very practice of philosophy in these particular things? And I think, when we've been saying this, I remember very well, again, Professor Raghuram Raju, whom many of you may know, once, I think, he was also so sick of this particular kind of questions of who is a philosopher, etc. I think when he went to give a talk at JNU, he began by saying, I'm not a philosopher, so I don't really, doesn't matter to me if you're going to call whether I'm a philosophy, what I do is philosophy or not. And that's a question which many people abroad now are asking. And I'm sure many of you have followed Jay Garfield's question is, about Chinese philosophy and whether the very problem about Chinese philosophy question over there, etc. Okay, and then there's another added problem. And I think this is a unique situation which we in India have to face. And this is not being faced by philosophers in Germany, US, Australia, or Britain, for example. We have what I call as a unique NRI problem. And, I'm not saying this just as a sociological political reflection. I'm saying this because it matters very deeply to the practices of our teaching and writing within the Indian context. There are prominent philosophers outside India. I'm very glad to know that there are very prominent philosophers, and they have done, obviously, they're very good scholars. I don't think, it's not a question about any of that. It's not about them at all. But it's about the question of us, not about them. It's about a question of our inheritance and what we respond to and how we build a philosophy community within India. Very interestingly, many of these people, because of the positions they hold in powerful academic institutions around the world, they control the discourse on not just Indian philosophy, that category of Indian philosophy, but also to the category of philosophy in India. You see some of the very influential books and essays and discussion points on some of these questions about what is happening in Indian philosophy or in philosophy in India are often revolves around a few names. And these people's engagement with the Indian educational system is almost zero. It's just a summer vacation visit. They do not know the kind of practices which our students are part of, the kind of resource crunch which people have, in which we have to teach philosophy, in which you have to write philosophy. And then this appropriation was so, blatantly, I'll give you an example in which it was blatantly exhibited. A couple of years back, I think, or a year or so back, there were a group of people who wanted to start something, they said, some philosophy and science group or something like that. I didn't know anything about it, and that's fine, because, in India, the other thing we often talk about are various mafias of different ethnicities, which is another very unique phenomena. But they were supposed to have this, and they had a big meeting apparently in Mumbai. And one of my students wrote to a couple of these people. There are a few people from the US who are in part of this group. And they wrote to one of them and said, look, this is the kind of work which people have been doing in philosophy of science in India. He was talking about various initiatives which many of us had done in different places. And then this person writes back. And I'm saying this because I think, as I said, it's not about individuals. I'm not naming anybody, but I'm just saying the kind of discourse which is behind this. And this person writes saying, yes, he is an Indian in some small place in the US, okay, doing philosophy of science. And he writes this mail to my student saying, basically paraphrasing, that what all of you are doing is not rigorous philosophy. We want to come and tell you what it is to do rigorous philosophy through this particular thing. We are coming as a group and we'll tell you what it is to do philosophy of science. And this is something which has happened in very many different ways. And I'm just sharing this because I think the question of what philosophy of science is and how philosophy of science should be done is something which very deeply related to this. And I think one of the most ironical aspects of this is the way in which the Indian philosophy itself has been appropriated by certain scholars. Now, it's very odd. If you think about it, for Western scholarship, there was a problem with Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy was not philosophy, it was religion, ... And then we went through a phase in which we were afraid to teach our own students Indian philosophy because we thought it was not philosophy, it's not serious philosophy, rigorous, whatever. Right? And then now if you see who are the people who are doing Indian philosophy, who are the spokespeople for Indian philosophy, there are many from, obviously, people from the West. And it has become blatant that the recent handbook on Indian philosophy, published by Oxford University Press, has no Indian, in quote unquote, working in India, that is, on Indian philosophy. Except my dear friend Gopal Guru, who wrote a piece on Ambedkar in that volume. And there are 2 or 3 Indians and all this stuff. People are working elsewhere, outside the country and so on. The point is, you know, I hope you see the politics of this. And the politics of this has been voiced very well. I have heard this myself, which is that you people haven't realized the importance of the traditions you have. So now, first it was the fact that an inheritance of philosophical traditions was not available to us. Now, we are too stupid to realize we haven't inherited such traditions and that they will now show us the importance of these traditions. Okay, and if it is sounding very rhetorical and political, I want to do that because I want to try and see where does the question of philosophy end with politics, and that's really the point I'm moving towards. And this is a very political question. The complete appropriation of the notions of Indian philosophy by I would call by interests which are dictated by various other concerns, including the concerns of surviving the Western academic system. So, what is it for us, given these conditions, what is it for us to do philosophy now? In what sense do I respond to these questions of doing philosophy now? Without getting into, all these divisions, analytical, continental, Indian, etc., etc. And to me, I can only share this with my thing, and maybe most of you may not think it's worth while thinking about this, but let me just say it in the very few minutes. I won't take any of your time. To me, a very important part of philosophy is to recover a more inclusive and critical spirit of doing philosophy. And that's what I meant by saying something organic. And in what sense? And I think it has to respond to different things. One, respond to public perception. In the context of responding to public perception, there has to be a deep resistance to the way philosophy has been marginalized. For example, when the ethics course has become a mandate from the Medical Council of India and in business studies, ethics courses are very often in many of these institutions, including the universities in which I had been associated with earlier, that they are being taught by doctors and engineers and others. They don't want to hire philosophy students to teach ethics, with very little exception. In many of our IISers and IITs, many of the new IISers and so on, philosophy of science is taught by scientists. They don't think you need a professional philosopher of science, somebody who's done philosophy of science in departments like this to come and teach philosophy of science. Because they think, what is it that philosophy is anyway contributing? I can come and do it. I can tell you what this is and you can learn from that. So this is a public perception problem. It is a problem in which we have not been able to articulate something as a collective. Of course, we have ICPR and all of you know about ICPR. But what is it about a collective voice? In India, every time there is something, you'll have this 100, 200 people signing things, right? You'll have scientists signing a petition against something. There'll be 150 scientists who are signing it. Where are the philosophers signing petitions? And many of them can even be even if it is just a ritual, at least I would like to see 100 philosophers signing petitions like this. So it brings a particular perception of a community of philosophy that exists together and talks to each other and maybe take some common positions about the society. And I think the other question which becomes very important, something which I'm sure many of you teach in your classes, but I'm not only referring to what you teach in your course, in your particular department, but I'm talking in general, that the methodological question in philosophy has to be clarified for us. We have vacillated between a textual, a complete dependence on the textual methodology of philosophy, but how do we open up many other different forms of methodological issues such as textual, conceptual, empirical, foundational, interdisciplinary, etc. And part of that challenge, which I find, especially with large number of students that I engage with, is that in philosophy, there is a tendency to engage with philosophers much more than itself. So engage with the thinkers. I mean, to talk about the thinkers rather than about the thoughts. And I think this raises new challenges for philosophy. And obviously your department, which is a very well-known department, is probably doing many of this. But I think in general, to me, the task of philosophy in this sense is to not just tell us how many books or how many authors we're going to read, but how you teach the skills of reading and writing first to students. In fact, most of my own philosophy workshops for students who are not in philosophy have all been on reading and writing workshops, which draws extensively on philosophy. And I think that's a doing philosophy for me. But it is about the very specific acts of, reading and writing and so on. And the question of the contemporary, how does the contemporary enter into our preoccupation to, do contemporary in our doing of philosophy? In other words, why is it that among all the communities that are present in India, which are responding to many of the social and political issues around the country, where is the philosophy community's voice present in all of them? How are we responding to questions of education, for example? And one exception was this very good book by Professor Miri on education, philosophy and education. But where is it voice on us reflecting on these questions of education, politics, the particular kind of politics that are happening, and what is even happening at DU itself, for example? So in a way, what this would mean to do philosophy, what distinguishes philosophers in that sense, and by doing this, I'm including a very inclusive definition of philosophers, is to take a moral and epistemic leadership. And that can come, I think both moral and epistemic leadership can only be present within our community, or at least this is something which the philosophy community can generate much better than most other communities can. But all of these are possible only if, in my biased, prejudiced view, it can only be possible if philosophy is more egalitarian, more inclusive, more welcoming, more political, and more organic, where the best learn the lesson from the best philosophers of the world, respond to the organic, not respond to somebody writing somewhere about something which then becomes my task for doing philosophy. Some of the greatest innovations, the great philosophies that we read is an extremely important part of bringing in the egalitarian, inclusive, political, organic, and much more creative. And that's a question about creative and autonomous, which philosophers have to grasp hold of. And I think, very often we think creativity in philosophy itself is a very important subject to think about. What does it mean to be creative, given the kinds of methodological issues we have in philosophy? And as I said, this is particularly, I'm only addressing these points to the students who are entering into this journey of philosophy. And the question is, how do you understand your engagement with various philosophical learnings in a very creative manner? And how do you start thinking about what is it to be in philosophical thinking and more autonomous and creative thinking within philosophy? I will stop here, Bala. So I hope I didn't take too much, I didn't go beyond too much time. Thank you so much for this.
No, not at all.
Talk to all of you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sundar, for that wonderful talk that you have given. In fact, you try to map what is philosophy and what is not philosophy, academia as well as per the society. How do we try to bridge the gap, and the need for bridging the gap and addressing the tension between these two is very important, which you have. Thank you so much for that wonderful exposition. And I think you can ask the questions. You can type the questions so that Sahana, would you mind reading the questions because I'm not able to access the chat? Would you mind?
No. I'll just do it. That's not. Thank you so much.
If you can access the questions, you can read the questions for Prof Sundar.
Yeah, I'll just read it out. So let's start with. Yes, Professor.
Professor Sarukkai, can you read the chats?
Yeah, I can also read the chat. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe you can pick up from there.
Okay. But if you want to, since there are too many, if you want to pick up something to start off with,
you decide.
Okay, I can start with one of the basic questions there from education requires transdisciplinarity, etc. Based on how do you look at the present national education policy? No, I think, I think I know the kind of work which has gone into the national education policy because I was a member of not this commission, but the Karnataka Knowledge Commission, which produced policies for higher education in humanities. I wrote the documents for Karnataka, where Professor Dr. Kasturangan was a chairperson. So I can see the kind of work and deep thinking, which should have at least great effort, which has gone into it. But I think there are some fundamental questions about humanities, as far as the humanities component within the national education policy is. I've actually written a larger piece in EPW called Blinkered View of Humanities on the national education policy. You can probably look at that. But I know that there's a revision that was on the draft national policy. I think one good thing about it is the fact that there is a lot more emphasis on interdisciplinarity means that philosophy becomes very prominent, because the only one discipline which brings together different disciplines, in my view, in my again biased view, is philosophy. Because I can students in physics, mathematics, social science, and something else, and talk to them in a common way, think through them with using philosophy as my basic tools. And therefore, if it is implemented properly, I really think there is a very good possibility of revival of some basic philosophical approaches, etc. But it also means that as philosophy students, there is a new challenge on you, that no longer can we use our philosophy to hide and build walls around us, but it has to be open. You'll have to be able to engage with your ideas of philosophy with, as I said, with children, with people in 12th standard doing geography and saying, why are you doing something called ontology? What a waste of my time. And once you engage with those questions, you really see, I think, how philosophy actually works. Because I think the fundamental principle of philosophy as teaching, it's fundamentally associated with the idea of education and teaching. And that is the essential aspect of philosophy. And therefore, in the national education policy, there is a scope, but unless we know how to operationalize it and unless you train teachers for it, I don't know how it's going to happen. But at least we know that there is a possibility. Is an Indian philosophy a spiritual philosophy? No, I'm not even going to answer that question, because it's an important question, but the answer is it is not. And I'm sure once you have done 2 years or whatever things, if you are a student there, you will hopefully realize the very complex underpinnings of Indian philosophy with very many different, if you like, rational, logical traditions and so on. And I think it may also help for many of you to realize that whenever we use this argument that Indian philosophy is a religious, spiritual philosophy, we should also recognize that there is no Western philosophical tradition which has not been overtly religious, including the famous group of the rationalists with Spinoza, Descartes, and people like Leibniz. Very deeply religious imagination, but the production of very important philosophical doctrines. So I think, there are both sides to it. So, in both cases, this question of religion philosophy is far more complicated than this. Curricula in schools and colleges, yes, I agree that we may have to curricula, but more important, for me, philosophy is not about content. It's about a method. It's a form of thinking. So when I do philosophy for children, I'm not teaching them any philosopher, what all these philosophers said. I teach them thinking, reading, writing. through it, we make sense of philosophical concepts. And it's, it's a great eye-opener for me to see how well the children actually engage with these very deep questions of reality and the irreal, the non-real, and so on, very well. And we'll never use any of the names of philosophers within that. It is just to get them to think through. Because remember, after all, a very well-known definition of philosophy, which sometimes is worth remembering, not always true, but called thinking about thinking. And therefore, it's a very useful way to understand things. And Navneet, there's a question about connection between philosophy and psychology. Yeah, I would, okay, it's a very large question, but I would still say that in the context in which I was talking about, like philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, and so on, there are foundational questions which can be understood. And I think one of the reasons why philosophy becomes foundational, whether I'm moving across from the sciences to the social sciences to literature, is because the kinds of questions and the kinds of vocabulary and the tools that you have allows you to actually move across questions. So you could ask the question like, what is the state of, the reality of an atom? In the same way that you could discuss what is the state of reality of a cell, for example. The kind of techniques that you use, the kind of arguments that you build upon, and so on. So I think if we go back to that foundational understanding of philosophy, you can always create new connections between any two disciplines, because philosophy does function as the mother of disciplines in the truest sense. Okay, I'm just looking at questions, studying philosophy, emancipated.
Yeah, if you think I should...
yeah, sorry.
Can I read the questions? Or,
yeah, no, I'm reading the... I've just come down to Jaya's question. Who are the three? If I may ask, yes, you may ask. But my lips are sealed. I'm sure many people know. Plato, yes, it's sounding rhetorical and oblong. Thank you. No, I agree with you. I'm not saying... I think the question about Indian philosophy, I think that's where you wrote this, and I think you're right. And I'm aware of it, so I'm saying it. It is also because we have not said it the other side at all. And we have to ask that question. It's a bit of a problem, right? That how is it that our autonomous hold and defining what philosophy should be for us has often been mortgaged to other interests? Why has it been so difficult for a long time within philosophy departments, even now to a very large extent, as far as I know, to work on Ambedkar as a philosopher? Why would that be? I mean, what is it that makes it so difficult for us to really open up our imagination of what philosophy should be and what the task of philosophy in the Indian context should be? Why are we doing philosophy? So I am placing it within that context, and I'm giving an example of the appropriation of Indian philosophy, and it's coming back to us now as something very important and that we should teach our students. So all the private universities that we are talking about, where, as Professor Balaganapati was saying, they are the ones who are charging a huge amount of money for students to do philosophy, when they are now coming back to Indian philosophy in a major way through many of these texts and approaches. So we have to pay attention to it. It's an important sociological reflection we need on the community of philosophy in India and what we are doing in philosophy of India. So is philosophy in India inclusive at present? The quick answer, of course, at the risk of offending more people than I have done today, is no. It is of course not inclusive. We have been very exclusive in various ways, including, as I gave you the many examples of how people who have been very important, writing important texts on philosophy in different languages, are not part of our philosophy community in this sense, in our university systems. Tribal philosophy, people do talk about it a bit now, but we have never been integrated it in a very meaningful sense. And these are the questions which you're asking: knowledge and tradition of tribal people, and including Ayurveda, for example, many different traditions of knowledge and so on. We have not done it, and we are still working with some paradigm of philosophy which is some texts, some philosophers. We don't even discover philosophy. And philosophy historically, we should remember, and we have to find ways to confront it. It is completely biased against gender, caste, and class. I mean, that's what we do. That's our inheritance. That's what we are doing now. And we need to understand that how does that play out in the practice of philosophy for us today, in how we teach our students today, and what kind of philosophy you expect them to do. Okay. Can redeem, yes, the how and the what is an important shift. Yeah, I don't think there can be any non-biographical for not exclusive. Yes, I totally agree with you, Mohan, about that. But the question again, the difficult task is not to say, let us include philosophies of tribal societies. What if somebody comes to you and says, how do I do it? Where are the questions? Where is your ontology of tribal society? Is that the language you will then use for it? Is it that in our great knowledge system that we possess, do we put categories on tribal philosophies in order to present them as philosophy to us? Okay, these are very deep exercises, and I think there is a lot to learn from this. I have a student who did his PhD on parts of tribal education, and we not even touch the boundary of the kind, change of framework we need in order to be able to make it something called philosophical. How do we do that question? Envision a pluralistic vision, and I think to me, and this is part of the problem. I feel that why would we do philosophies as different philosophies? When in the part of the Manipal experiment was to try and see if I can teach philosophy in terms of concepts rather than geographies. So I've always been very surprised by this fact that when we talk of causality, and you will talk, all of you would have done Hume, you will read that whole hackneyed argument about human causality. But some of the most interesting discussions, far more complex, arise, for example, between the Nyaya, the Buddhist debate, from the Arabic Islamic philosophers on causality. It's such a deeply interesting topic on how to understand causality. And imagine, I'm just teaching one aspect of it through Hume and say that's the part of the causality that I want to teach. To me, if I want to teach causality, I want to teach Aristotle, of course, those 4 moments of causality, causation. Then, of course, talk to Hume and very importantly, Kant. But these are ideas. It doesn't matter to me who they are. When they're presenting their ideas, I would also include various other ideas on causality which have come from different people. In other words, the way to envision philosophy here is as a stream and network concepts which speak across geographies and boundaries. And that way, I'm not saying that what they did is useless, this people did. I'm just trying to, for me, I'll tell you why I do philosophy, okay? And how I approach any of the problems I have written in all my books or papers I write. I have a problem, I don't understand it, I want to make sense of it. So even the cracked mirror, it became a problem of something earlier. My first book was actually called Translating the World, began by a simple question. I didn't understand how people would read. What is the reading theory or reading strategy of reading scientific texts, which have drawn different semiotic systems? And it is using philosophy to answer my fundamental ignorance about things around me, which I don't understand. That's why I begin with it. And I did the Indian philosophy and philosophy of science book because in all my philosophy of science that I was reading, both as a student and in all my work, I was very struck by this very simple point. How is it that philosophy of science is a discipline completely ignores non-Western traditions? And why were non-Western? Why am I interested in that question? Not because I think I'm an Indian. I'm not trained in Indian philosophy. I didn't know what the kinds of complexities in Indian philosophy when I started being aware of this question. Then it took me time to understand it and learn it. But I was just asking the simple question. How is it that if philosophy of science is talking about questions of the real, the unreal, okay, about causality, for very important questions in philosophy of science, observations, perception, all these kind of explanations, nature of language, very important questions in philosophy of science, how come you teach this discipline for 100 years across the world, write your major texts on it, and there's not one mention of anybody other than 5 or 6 countries of what we call the great white males of European civilization who are even mentioned? And I took it as a question to say, look, no point in my saying other civilizational cultures can contribute to our philosophical understanding of science. So what did I do? I tried to show it. It may be faulty. I don't know that it's successful or not. That's not my point. I entered into the questions of logical traditions in Indian theories of language in various Indian traditions in order to ask the question, how do these philosophical traditions matter to contemporary philosophy of science? Not to some ancient theories of science, contemporary philosophy of science. I think there are very fascinating connections between that. And that's a way in which I think they talked about the creative imagination in philosophy and how we do philosophy. To me, at least, that's what it was. So, as I said, it's just one particular view, which may be very limited, and maybe many people may not think it's worth doing either. But okay, I don't, Professor Shashi has asked about philosophy for children. No, I don't call it lifestyle career. I actually call it philosophy for children. And it's also part of the reason why I call it philosophy for children. So now the book I wrote, it's called Philosophy for Children. And, there is this magazine in Hindi called Cycle, which is run for school children, which is published by an NGO in Bhopal. They take it to various schools in North India, on Hindi medium schools. So I started writing articles for them, which they translated into Hindi and sent to students. So we started with, my original plan was to do a book on philosophy for children with the children. So the idea was I would write an article and the children would all write back. And I would use that and write the next lesson and build a philosophy with them. And I wanted to use the word philosophy because I think if the way in which we respond to the problems in society today is to start with children, and I think philosophy has a great role to play in this, just in terms of clear thinking, if nothing else, okay? And I know critical thinking is now, everybody is doing it across universities and so on. So what I did was, I sent this first article was called Seeing, how to think about seeing, and it's a series of small exercises. And even the workshops I do with children, we do it like that. And then, I have about 200 to 300 letters in Hindi from children. Unfortunately, I'm not a great Hindi reader. I can read those things. But the time it was taking for me to reproduce a whole book with children was so much longer, because we wanted to get the material to the children, that I sent them the whole book, and it now come out in Hindi and so on. So we are very clear that what we are saying, philosophy for children, but by philosophy, I'm only talking to them about, including, as I said, reading, writing, thinking, and then talk about mathematics, art, and being so on in their own world, being entirely within their world. So we'll have to see whether it is, how useful or relevant it is. But, even for adults, when I have done reading, writing, even for PhD students, I used to do just reading, writing workshops as a way of doing philosophy, So, so for children, I really want to push at this. And my aim, I'm now a little more ambitious, it may not happen. I want to do these books for children on philosophical topics, like democracy, like religion, like secularism, whatever it is. Because, I think their response to these things are very interesting. And if we can get a few ways of thinking philosophically at that level, I'm sure, at least for the next generation, that many of them will come to your department. It's not for that, but, at least we'll have more people thinking seriously about some of these questions. What is the task of philosophy? Yes. Sorry, yeah, you have to say?
Just to make a point that, most, when you talked about are not being able to reach out, or somehow something is not working in reaching out to the larger community, each one of them are, doing philosophy in their own way. I think what they do not want us to use is a whole lot of jargon.
Yes.
And I was just wondering whether the word philosophy itself is highly loaded, and therefore, as soon as you say, I'm going to teach a course in philosophy, well, that might just push them back. So that was my
No, you're very correct. I think the moment you say, as I said, the moment we announced philosophy for children workshops, as I said, many people said immediately, no, why philosophy at that age and all that. So we said, no, we will do it. And as I said, given the enormous interest in children and their parents, so we had to do multiple ones to fit all of them in. We recognized that there was some value. So it actually showed that there's some value to the circulation of this word within. And some students came thinking it'll be about culture and religion and all that stuff. But as much as possible, we had made sure what we were going to do. But, it was so much of fun for them. They do things, they shout, fight, they play things. But the point is about learning the core questions of philosophy. And yes, I think that's an important point that you're saying. And I don't know, in Hindi, the moment we come to translation, of course, it becomes far more worrisome. I can escape more easier with English. Because in the Hindi, I don't know, Darshana or Tattva Shastra, Pramana Shastra, something, it might become, I don't want to use any of those terms. So you're very right. So maybe that's part of our challenge to find a way to, coin new terms for us. Again, hopefully as a community. So I don't know, yes, is there a guideline for engagement? Okay. We have just been I've just been doing this with my students, many of whom now are no longer students, they're all independent teachers, but we just started with them and we've been doing it for different people. So I'm sure there are different ways of doing these philosophy for children, but hopefully when the book comes out, maybe you'll have some idea what kind of approach we have taken. And I'm sure there are, maybe better approaches, but I think it's important to engage with them. That's, part of it is to, I think I want to draw on J. Krishnamurti here very deeply, because part of our engagement with philosophy is to remove the fear in education, the fear in the classroom. And in that sense, philosophy should be liberating, but liberating to all the class. Now, it's not just about the smartest people, and they are not really the radar for me at all. It's liberating for students in the class who feel marginalized and who feel that, learning and education is a great stress and tension on them. Do you teach? No, again, the question is, when I teach students reading and writing, no, actually, I mean, we begin by looking at what is teaching reading and writing, what are the processes of reading and writing. So, for example, in the Manipal, when we started the course, the first course we did in our MA, the first semester was a whole semester course on reading and writing, which was about theories of reading and writing, which is about the processes of reading and writing and stuff like that, with focus on philosophical texts, but to open up the space of just reflecting on those particular points, and not about specific texts. And it's not even writing about philosophical thought, it's not jargonistic, etc. No, it's about writing different types of writing popular, writing serious, writing academic papers, and so on, a variety of different kinds of writing. Yeah, if any of you want to get in touch, please send me an email. What is philosophy can never be answered like this. Okay, very good. But it's a good point which Subhashini is saying. What is philosophy can never be answered? I don't know. I won't say it can never be answered. But what is interesting is this also, that many philosophers write on what is philosophy. You'll never see a scientist writing a book called What is Physics, What is Chemistry, What is Mathematics, to the level at which philosophers, major philosophers, write on what is philosophy. That, I think, the self-reflection is part of philosophical thinking anyway, but this is, I think, much deeper than, okay, you are already in philosophy department, so I'm sure you'll learn more about ontology later. Look like it's a toned down history of philosophy. Okay, this is also a question. I do understand Jairam's point that, I do think it's a problem in my view. And again, as I said, it's a biased view, and I'm sure there are other people who have different views. To reduce philosophy to history of philosophy is a great shame. And there is a history for it. There is a reason why this happens. And some of you should go back and look at the historical records of the 19th century and the early 20th century, when a movement called scientific philosophy begins, and then there is a split, which creates many of the leftover problems we carry between analytical and continental philosophy. The early Heidegger and Husserl would have been as much comfortable doing analytical philosophy, what we would call as analytical philosophy in that sense of the term. But the break means that historically that you start looking at the questions of history as a definite philosophy, and which has made us move into a kind of scholasticism of a particular kind. And scholasticism becomes, the matter of philosophy becomes a matter of what a word means or where it is in a particular text. I think it's important. Okay, it's extremely important that there's a particular kind of scholasticism that philosophy teaches you that's very important. But to if you did your whole course around history of philosophy without trying to engage with the questions of how philosophy has been so useful for our contemporary understanding of the world, how it has changed concepts around the world, etc., then I think we have missed a major opportunity to learn what philosophy is. Yep, ontology. Okay, there are so many questions of ontology, Saubik.
Sundar, I think that is.
Yeah.
Fine.
Okay. All right. I'll just see if there are any other questions. Okay.
The same questions got repeated, so that's fine.
Okay, I think Anuradha has one point which I just see seem to be interested in the production and the fundamental differences between different schools of thought. So should we not be studying as different points of view about the same issues? Yeah, I think that's a very useful way to look at it, to look at analytical content as different points of view, or maybe why analytical philosophy would study the question of being so differently from the way continental philosophy would do, and how the very, very definitions of ontology, epistemology, etc., would work out differently in them. So, yeah, I was just only talking about the inability of there to be cross-pollination or acceptance of different kinds of philosophical systems as part of a larger kind of philosophy in that sense. So it was only in that context. Okay. I think
all the questions.
Fariz Gulzar has a point about not including Islamic philosophy. Yeah, I don't understand why. I think it's absolutely essential for anybody, not for people who are talking with ancient Indian philosophy. I'm not even interested in that. If anybody is interested in Western philosophical tradition, then you cannot avoid engaging with the Muslim philosophers. Because the origin of Western philosophical tradition, which is the Greek transmission, goes through Islamic philosophers who protects the Greek, who commented upon them and transmitted it to them. And if we don't understand the way in which their own engagement with Greek thought was, it is, I think we really miss out something very important about understanding why we get so caught up with certain kinds of traditions in Western philosophy. So I agree. I think it should also be subaltern philosophy from the Indian context. So it's not just about, the caste question in Indian context, but thankfully we have extremely, extremely reactionary philosophies like the Buddhists and the Jaina against caste questions. So at least there you have some kind of a distribution. But definitely, various questions around inclusion should be integral to how we talk about, philosophy today. Okay. All right. I think, Balanti, we have actually finished everything in the questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sundar, for addressing all the questions. That's very important because there are a lot of students and research scholars who are trying to engage with you, who have been waiting to listen to you. Because last time also we have announced your talk and we couldn't organize that. So thank you so much for addressing all the queries that our students and our colleagues and research scholars have addressed. Yeah, you began with what is it to do? What is it to do? ... Whether it is philosophy or any discipline for that matter in India, and it is a well delved one. And definitely, what is it? In fact, I remember sometime back, I have written a small piece on philosophical community. Is there a philosophical community in India? If at all it is there, what is it? Is it just academia, which is philosophical community? Or should we look back and try to understand that there was community philosophizing, which was largely ignored by academia, and that's a very important aspect that is to be understood. and also when we are looking at the contemporary times, how is it that how is it that the transition from there is no philosophy in Asian countries to you don't know how to do philosophy in being an Asian has come, and how which means discarding to hijacking, the transition that has happened, which is very interesting. Thank you so much for delving on all these aspects, and also towards the end, giving us a hint as to how to rediscover, discovering the inclusive and organic kind of spirit that you are stressing, the way in which we can start doing philosophy in India in a more inclusive way. That is very interesting, and thank you so much for those thoughts. And I thank you for accepting our invitation and being here and addressing all the questions of our students and all the participants. I thank all of them, all our participants, for being here and engaging with Professor Sundar. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Well, it's a great pleasure being with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.